So, remember, Darwin's theory of evolution, actually Wallace's too, is a kind of a generation later. Their difference in age by 20 years. He came up with evolution by natural selection and also descent from a common ancestor in the 1850s. Darwin, of course, never actually published until all of a sudden up comes this fellow who he was corresponding with anyway. But the great ideas were descent with modification, or descent from a common ancestor, and then, of course, evolution by natural selection. So, remember, Darwin had two great ideas. Their first one, we'll say, is descent from a common ancestor. Well, Wallace also, same thing. He wrote an 1855 paper. The 1859 paper is the one that he sent to Darwin, but he also published the 1855 paper, and that was descent from a common ancestor. And he came to it primarily because of biogeography. And Darwin, though, of course, came to it more from captive breeding, also from his travels in the Beagle around the world when he was a young fella. So, descent from a common ancestor is pretty much like someone descending from their ancestors, their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents. And so it works the same way. Hold on. Okay. This is not your family tree on the left. Great-grandfather, grandfather, father, you. This is your family tree. Okay. So, great-grandparents. If you look back on the tree, they second cousins and then all the other ones, cousins, siblings, and you. This is pretty much like a phylogeny. It's actually, though, what do they call it? It's the same sort of thing in terms of looking at relationships. And so here's the node. So they go second cousins, and all the rest go back and have a shared common ancestor in the great-grandparents. The grandparents, cousins, and then siblings, you, and parents. Okay, so that's what happens with parents and offspring. Of course, fish, salamander, cat, you, not like that at all. We have a common ancestor, let's say, of all vertebrates. The first vertebrates actually weren't actually fish. They were jawless fish. So we have fish, and then sister taxa to the fish are this whole other group, including all tetrapods. So not only we actually have fish, limbed fish, or like the coelacanth or the African lungfish that actually can. Those were the first kind of vertebrates or that actually were up on land, and we've got a whole bunch of transitional fossils that actually show this. The Niels Shubin has found and demonstrated. So tetrapods, all tetrapod vertebrates are all vertebrates. They include amphibians. They include reptiles, including a whole bunch of different groups of reptiles. The squamates, like lizards and snakes. The turtles and tortoises. Crocodiles. Dinosaurs. Birds. And mammals. It turns out mammals split off from an earlier reptile before some of these other groups actually showed up. And of course, common ancestors, they have traits that define them. So for mammals, obviously they have fur, and not like birds or not like other reptiles that have no kind of covering besides their skin. And they have mammary glands as well. So this is basically descent from a common ancestor, which is very much like descent from, in terms of who you're descended from, in terms of your family. Evolution in the same sort of historical way. So why do family members resemble each other? What do you think? Okay. In other words, they share alleles and that are identical by descent. They inherited them from the same folks. So siblings, you inherit them from your parents. You're related to your parents by 50%. You're also related to your siblings if you both have the same parents by 50%. So we know why they resemble each other. And it's because of historical factors. Okay. Is the resemblance of relatives similar to the resemblance of species? What do you think? Similar or not? Do you think species are descended from a common ancestor? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Same sort of thing. You have species that are, you have a common ancestor, and why are they similar to each other?
Because they lived in a similar area,
No, that's convergent evolution. Why do species that are descended from other species similar? What? Yeah. Yeah. So they're the same lineage. They're part of the same lineage. They inherit characteristics. So different species, different animals, we'll say, resemble each other for one of two reasons. Either they're related to each other, or they do live in an environment similar, but they're not related, but it's because of environmental factors that are similar that you get the same sort of convergent evolution. So you can say that birds have feathers, or let's say they fly. Insects also fly, but that's because flight is a convergent trait among insects and birds. Okay. And then, of course, why might descendants of either resemble their ancestors? And we just went over that. So species that are related phylogenetically, in other words, because of their evolutionary history, are more likely to resemble their relatives than they are to other lineages. The only other reason that species might end up looking like each other or acting like each other, any sort of phenotype, is because of similar environmental pressures. So if you look at an ichthyosaur, which was a marine reptile back during the dinosaur age, they looked very much like dolphins. They probably filled the same sort of niche. There weren't any mammals back. Well, no, there were mammals, but no marine mammals at that point, for sure. Now, they both have a fusiform body. That means kind of a long shape that's good for moving through water. But if you actually look at, let's say, their genetics, well, they don't have genetics. Well, they're extinct. So it's fossil. If you used anatomical features, bones and stuff, they're clearly distinctly different. And that's called convergent evolution. Now, in that case, you can say, okay, this is because of that. This organism has this trait because of natural selection. Because this lineage has it, and a sister lineage doesn't. So we're saying, okay, why does this species over here look more like this compared, and not to their relative, but to some other, yeah.
I remember reading a while ago, and I don't remember what the reason they gave for it is, but they said that the natives of Brazil and the Aborigines, the natives of Australia, when they compared their DNA sequences, that they had similar.
Yeah, that's
but they're really far apart. And,
yeah.
what point?
They don't share very, very much, and they're wondering how did that happen, because the Aborigines got to Australia between 40 and 60 million years ago, the first migration out of Africa of modern humans. The thing is, we didn't have the population of North America until, let's say, 15 or 20,000 years ago. And in fact, by the 14,000 years ago, both North America and South America were populated by that original group. So how would you get that kind of sharing of alleles between one group and another? And that's recent, and I forget what it is, but it could be that, I'm trying to think. Okay. I forget, actually.
Yeah, would it have to be like during the time of the land bridge?
Oh, no.
Like not that far back?
No. Well, first of all, the land bridge between North and South America, yeah, that's 3 million years ago. So from 3 million, this happened way later, right? Because humans didn't even really show up for 200,000 years ago instead of 3 million. So it's not that. The question is, why do you have this apparent gene flow between two disparate groups that had never met? It might actually be because of gene trees versus species trees. A species tree is like what we see here. Well, gene families have the same sort of thing, and sometimes you have what's called uneven lineage sorting that can kind of lead you astray. That's one explanation. Another, perhaps, is that
maybe they traveled there.
They could have.
Like by sea.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly both of them had, to one degree or another, ocean-going vessels. The question is whether, now we know that there's some good evidence that, I know how it probably happened. Okay. There's some evidence that this first wave actually interbred with this archaic human called Denisovans. And that group that then made it to Australia, that includes Australia, New Guinea, some other Pacific islands around there, the Melanesians, they actually have up to about 6% Denisovan DNA. Okay. Now, this is the group that became part of the Polynesian explosion, where they went all over the Pacific. People in, let's say, northern Asia and Europe and all that, we don't get that. We don't have that mixing with Denisovans. We have it with Neanderthals instead. And then in Africa, there's also, looks like erectus, archaic human interactions there. Okay, so because the Polynesians were able to travel very well, I mean, they were incredible navigators, there's some evidence that they actually made it to North America. And they might have bred with the natives, but they didn't actually start colonies there like they did on oceanic islands that were uninhabited. So that's probably the most likely explanation for it, is that this group of Polynesians, they had some of this shared genetic stuff with Australians and New Guineans and that whole group. So I think that's what happened.
Okay, so sorry, this is going more into human evolution, but the first human ancestors originated from Africa, right?
Yeah.
But by that time, there's still more primitive human species like Neanderthal and the Samoan, like you were saying.
Yeah.
That
So
they could still interbreed with the modern human.
Yeah. Now there wasn't between Neanderthal and then Europeans and Asians, we share about 1% to 2% of our DNA with Neanderthals. They recovered this DNA because ancient DNA, the group by Svante Pavo in Germany, they were able to actually recover ancient DNA and show how Neanderthals and humans were related to each other, and Denisovans the same way. And of course, you can put it on our phylogeny, and you can get a kind of an estimate of when they split, the two groups split apart. But like donkeys and horses, they were able apparently to breed. It looks like with Neanderthals, there wasn't very much introgression between either population of alleles from one side or the other. Like I said, only 1% to 2%. And it very well could be, another thing is, each lineage has a different mitochondrial DNA haplotypes. That means if they really bred a lot together, you would expect those haplotypes to share just like the nuclear genome would as well. So it actually might be Haldane's rule that there might have been female hybrids produced, but not males. The males were, because they're the heterogametic sex. So males oftentimes have genetic diseases that show up that females are only carriers of, like color blindness. What's the other one? Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Whole bunch of genetic diseases. Females are characters, these are recessive. Females are carriers, and if they mate with another carrier, or with an individual man, let's say, who actually has the disease, they'll likely have offspring, same sort of thing. Okay, so it looks like, and then there's also evidence, in fact, that there was another round of interbreeding later on with Asians, and so they have slightly higher integration between Neanderthals and that group. And then, like I said, the only group with the Australasians, those are the only group that showed interbreeding between Denisovans and modern humans, and that first wave out of Africa. But before that, prior to that, like Homo erectus clearly left Africa previously, probably 1.5 million years ago. Peking man, Java man, all these kinds of archaic humans, not in North America, but around the globe, across Asia and all that. So they were there first. In fact, some of those lineages probably gave rise to, let's say, Neanderthals or Denisovans, after they had moved out of Africa. Okay, so that's kind of how it worked. Okay. So why are neither the descendants of families or species identical? Why are you not identical to your brother or sister? Anybody? How come you're only 50% related? Because you only share 50% of their genes. The same thing with species or any kind of taxonomic distribution. They share a common ancestor, but they're likely not to share exactly the same stuff because after they split, they probably started encountering, well, there's genetic drift going on, and they probably encountered different ancestral environments or new environments from which they then were likely to evolve by natural selection to better fit those environments. So when we look at the comparative method, as I've mentioned before, we want to try to determine, is this trait, in this case let's say behavior, the result of inheritance from our ancestors, or is it a derived trait that only a certain lineage exhibits, but its sister lineages don't? And so this common ancestor kind of thing, we can use a phylogeny to actually determine that sort of thing by mapping behavioral characters onto a phylogenetic tree just like we do with morphological, physiological characters, fossils, all that kind of stuff. Great. Okay. So, did everybody bring their bathing suits? Okay. We don't need them. If you want them, or if you want to jump in the water, you can, just so you know. Just I'd let you know, but you don't need them. For those of you who are going on the field trip. I tried to arrange the weather for you, so I think I did a pretty good job. Right? I had to contact, the people in the clouds to make it so, but beyond that, anybody in here surf? There you go. Good. That's even better than getting pregnant and having kids. Because if you do that, you get an A, automatic A in the class. But if you surf, I might just give you the A anyway. Who else surfs?
And we don't want to be eaten by sharks or something.
What?
We don't want to be eaten by sharks. So.
Oh, fuck. I don't even care about that. Listen, first of all, you never see the one that gets you. Okay? So, there's only a very short window of sheer terror, and then it goes away. Because you go away.
You get points for jumping in the water?
What?
You get points for jumping in the water?
Yeah. But when I surfed for years. The only time I ever saw a shark was in Hawaii when I was diving. So, but they're out there. The thing is, if you really want to see a great white, go where there's lots of seals, and then jump in the water and see what happens. Okay. Oh, I know. We have to turn this on. When we end the class, I've got stuff for you guys to sign for liability and who all is in the class for future field trips and all that. So, but we'll get to that. And then I got a whole bunch of data sheets as well that I made for everybody. And we'll go over the assignment, but it's pretty simple. I had the wrong thing up. It was like 150 pages. It's just 3 pages. Okay, it's candid camera. I've got an iPad. Some of you have iPads. The rest of you probably have smartphones. So we're going to be using those in terms of different kinds of sampling. Okay, and everybody's going to be in pairs. Okay. Okay. What's evolution by natural selection? What do you think? Don't worry, it's okay. Forget about it. Everybody else around here, they're all idiots. Okay, it's just you and me, we're just going to talk. So what's evolution by natural selection? Darwinian evolution. Okay. Why would, let's say the ichthyosaurs, which were 60 or 70 million years ago, look like modern day porpoises in terms of how they look and how their body is? Yes, they do. Exactly. So that's an example of actual natural selection. The environment selects or favors the same sort of phenotype, but they're distantly related. So that's one thing. Is natural selection, evolution by natural selection, a random process or not? Anybody? And remember, drift is a random process, genetic drift, where alleles change, let's say neutral alleles or alleles that aren't under strong selection, just because of mutations show up, they don't have any effect on fitness. But natural selection, do certain individuals with certain traits or versions of traits do better than others with natural selection, evolution by natural selection? Okay, right? So you have some lineage that, or let's say in a population, you have some individuals that show a certain behavioral trait. Let's say some individuals are bold, others are shy in terms of behavioral traits. Now, it turns out that both kinds of behaviors or traits are usually found in a population, in social organisms. But we'll leave that for now. Some individuals might actually have a trait that other individuals in the population don't. And that trait actually confers a higher fitness advantage compared to everyone else in the population. Fitness, that means what's going to happen? Are they going to leave more offspring or less? More, right? So this is what's called an adaptation. They leave, and then if you roll this algorithm, because that's really all it is, natural selection, evolution by natural selection, into the future, whose genes are going to be more prevalent in future populations? The individuals who were better adapted to that environment versus the other individuals in the population who weren't. You would expect the population in the future, there'd be more versions of the adapted individuals' alleles, because those alleles are actually adapted to this new environment than the other. Okay. I want you guys to read up a little bit on Darwinian natural selection so you're a little bit more familiar with it. I know you probably haven't had evolution for a while, but this is essentially an evolutionary biology class pertaining to animal behavior. Okay? What is evolution by natural selection? It's any consistent difference in survival and reproduction and the passing of genes from one generation to the next among phenotypically, that means physiology, anatomy, behavior, development, genotypically, different alleles. Some alleles have higher fitness than others, and individuals who have them leave a greater proportion of their alleles to future generations. And then, of course, there's also the epigenome as well, which we read about last week. And epigenetic modifications, whether it's methylation, whether it is changes in transcription factors, whether it's actually different kinds of RNA, all affect the epigenome, and much of the epigenome is actually heritable as well. And those individuals, so that have what we'll say is adaptations, in other words, traits that give them higher fitness than others, they will be leaving a greater proportion of their DNA to future generations. Natural selection, we think of descent with modification. Descent from a common ancestor, Darwin's first great idea, and then evolution by natural selection, which is the modifying force. There's other forces, of course. A horse, of course. My name is Mr. Ed. So there are other forces, but none of them actually lead to adaptation. So genetic drift is random. Some alleles drift to fixation or go extinct, change frequency over generations based on population size, of course. So drift is stronger in small populations than large. Mutation is random as well. Sometimes, mostly the mutations are usually either have no effect or very little effect or are deleterious. Occasionally they might be beneficial. And that's there's the basis for, of course, the variation for natural selection to work on. But mutation by itself, random mutations don't happen very often, and so mutation by itself is a very slow process, a very slow random process. There's also non-random mating. That changes the frequencies of alleles in the population. It also reduces the effective population size, but again, it's not adaptive. So the only thing that is adaptive, of course, is evolution by natural selection. So natural selection is the only mechanism that consistently generates adaptive modifications. In other words, an adaptation is a variant of a trait that results in higher fitness for those that have it, and they leave more offspring, and they also pass their genes on to future generations in a higher proportion than individuals who don't have the adaptation. So natural selection is the only mechanism that consistently generates adaptive modifications. That means traits that individuals that have them have higher fitness, leave more of their DNA to future generations than individuals that don't have it. So an adaptation is a trait variant that confers higher fitness on an individual in the present environment. Is there a difference between natural selection and then evolution by natural selection? You can have selection. Let's say a meteor strikes the Earth as it did with the dinosaurs, and a meteor is not something that's a selective force that's common. There's no adaptations for individuals to actually survive it. Though we could say that, certain species or lineages might have a better chance. Fossorial animals, the ones that bury themselves or live underground for the most part, might have survived. Birds or dinosaurs, they're the only dinosaurs that actually survived, perhaps because they were able to fly. But you can have just kind of random events happen that perhaps decrease an individual's survival or increase, but it's a random event. It's not likely to happen over again and again over periods of time or continuously. And so it's certainly natural selection, but it doesn't lead to evolution by natural selection. So questions about natural selection. If a lion eats you, is that natural selection? Of course it is. If you get the girl and I don't, story of my life, is that selection? Yes, it is. In this case, instead of on survival, it is on reproductive success. If I bop you on the head and kill you, is that natural selection? Sure. If you get hit by a bus, is that natural selection? Well, I know a bus isn't alive, but it certainly is selective for us. And it's also probably a number of people get hit by buses or cars or whatever because they just don't pay attention to their surroundings. That's certainly a trait. So individuals who are more vigilant or do pay attention probably leave more offspring than individuals that don't. And that's certainly a trait. There's variation in it as well. So individuals, in this case, is going to be behavior. Some individuals have better cognitive abilities. They don't get drunk as much. They don't take risks as much. So that's natural selection. You could even have a situation where you have someone who gets hit by a bus, but because the individual's skin is actually thicker and he's big, the bus doesn't kill him, and he goes on and leaves more offspring with thick skin too. And over time, the skin thickens to a point where eventually you have a population of humans that almost have skin that's like bony plate that would actually protect them from a bus. But it's probably unlikely. Is there natural selection living in a modern society? Certainly. Now, we don't think about what our ancestors lived and what kind of a society they generally lived in. They were usually hunter-gatherers in small groups of individuals where everybody knew everybody else. They occasionally ran into other groups, some of which they were related to, and so, in fact, some of their members, usually women or girls, would actually disperse over to another small group, and there'd be this trade, gene flow either way. But also, these small groups, they were generally egalitarian, but if they met another group that they weren't familiar with, that was generally a dangerous situation. Kind of like the prisoner's dilemma, but you don't really need cops working on it. It's pretty much, you can either cooperate with this new group of people, or you can try to kill them, or perhaps just be cautious. And then, of course, the outcomes, well, if you cooperate and the other group doesn't, they try to kill you, you lose, they win, and vice versa. It's probably unlikely, so the first thing you really want to do is be very cautious and perhaps just take them out. Now, in a modern society, we come across strangers all the time. And we generally don't, get freaked out. Just meet strangers and nothing happens. There's laws, and so there's a kind of a policing mechanism. Perhaps we've adapted to larger societies over time. Larger modern societies, of course, have relaxed selection on things that would normally have killed us, like disease. But in terms of small groups, when we were in hunter-gatherer groups, there might be disease, but it would probably only wipe out that group and not necessarily spread to other groups. In a large modern society, if there is a new disease, it is carried much more effectively and can turn into an epidemic. But of course, there's a lot of things that we don't die of now that we used to in the past. And so there's also, like I mentioned, the social environment has changed drastically. Now, there are some places where in large cities that are actually very dangerous, like South Africa. South Africa, there is a lot of violence, actually within societies. They have a lot of carjackings, a lot of murders, lots of guns. You usually don't go out by yourself. Sometimes you take bodyguards, or there's a whole bunch of you. There's also, how do you approach someone who looks like they're perhaps aggressive? Do you not make eye contact and hope they leave you alone? Or do you actually stand up straight and make yourself look bigger so that that individual might actually think, that might be a little bit of danger there, because what if he actually can fight back? So modern societies differ in terms of the selective forces, but certainly social environments are much different. So what are the requirements for evolution by natural selection? Like, who's it going to be? Who's it going to be? Well, it's probably the chicken with the longer neck. He stands out. He's different than all the other chickens in terms of size. In other words, there's a bit of variation. So there has to be variation that exists among individuals. This variation, otherwise, if every individual was exactly the same, selection wouldn't work at all. There has to be heritable variation. So if neck length is actually heritable, then that heritable variation can be acted on by natural selection. And individuals, of course, with the trait that's favored, leave more offspring. So here we have selection. In this case, the selection is the axe, and it'll have an effect on fitness. And unfortunately, it's probably going to be the guy with the long neck who gets knocked out and eaten for dinner. And then evolution by natural selection gradually transforms populations over time, results in adaptations that make individuals more likely to survive or reproduce, mainly passing a greater proportion of their DNA to future generations than others. So what's the spice of life? Well, it's variation. If everybody was identical, or everything in the world was identical, it would be a pretty boring place. Now, here I have these peppers circled. And they're all different sizes. They're also different, some are mild and some are extremely hot. And of course, we cultivate them. But it turns out mammals are the only ones that that are affected by, they have taste buds, and that are affected then by this hot. So they feel it. Now, normally with other mammals, it would be a deterrent, wouldn't it? Birds, on the other hand, don't have necessarily taste buds, or very few birds do, and they might be actually the dispersal mode that's usually most effective. And so they're not affected by it, by the heat, and so they disperse it, and perhaps birds do a better job of dispersal than, let's say, mammals. Now, of course, we are a mammal, and in this case, it turned out that having that very hot taste was something that we liked, and so we modified it into an agricultural product that we use all the time, that we breed for, different kinds of taste, and some are mild and whatever. We see a lot of variation on faces and butterflies. Everywhere we see variation. Much of it is heritable, of course, and then there's also variation in our DNA, in our epigenome. In terms of humans, the greatest amount of variation in our DNA, where the most alleles are, is actually Africa, which is consistent with the idea that humans actually originated in Africa and then spread to the rest of the world. So our phenotype, it's an organism's genomic or epigenomic expression in terms of the environment it lives in, physiology, anatomy, development. All these things can result behavior. All these things are part of an organism's actual phenotype. Now, a genome, of course, we're talking about DNA, DNA and alleles, different substitutions that result in, these are mutations. Also, our genome changes because of recombination from sexual reproduction. And then, of course, we have the epigenome. These are non-genetic, heritable mechanisms of gene expression, for example, like methylation. So methylation, if a methyl group is attached to a certain point in the DNA, it will actually stop any more gene expression of that gene. There's also different kinds of RNA that do the same sort of thing. And because it's heritable variation as well. So here we are in terms of variation. Members of a population vary in the traits they display. So we have beetles, ladybird beetles. Inheritance, offspring tends to resemble their parents. Differential reproductive success. Brighter beetles are bitter, and predators learn to avoid them. Bright beetles are more likely to survive, and thus more likely to reproduce than our dull-colored beetles. So the result is evolution by natural selection, where we have beetles that are essentially protected because they have some sort of toxin that makes them bitter, and that jays just don't like to eat them. Or perhaps it's the toxin that makes them sick. Think about monarch butterflies, which have a toxin from milkweed that they incorporate. They start eating it when they're larvae, and so it actually protects them. Evolutionary fitness and adaptation. So, what is fitness? Well, the size of an organism's genetic contribution to the next and future generations. It's a function of survival, but more importantly, it's a function of reproductive success. Even if you don't live as long, but you leave more offspring and a greater contribution to the future generation, the alleles that you have are going to spread, even though your survival might be less. So, for example, a lot of humans, when they're teenage boys, they're essentially displaying, and they're usually risk-taking, and some take more risks than others. The females like that. Also, of course, if a male can actually afford the risk, in other words, it doesn't kill him, then that's an indication perhaps of good genes for the male. Plus, the male, because he takes risks, he also might be sought after by many females, and so he'll have sexy sons and give them sexy sons as well. Even if eventually this individual who takes lots of risks pisses off some other guy who shoots him. But by that time, he's already ended up with lots of offspring. So an adaptation, again, is a heritable trait that increases an individual's fitness in a particular environment compared to those without that trait variant. It has to be variation that's heritable, that selection can act on, and then selection, if it does act on it, we have an adaptation. And adaptations, of course, tend to be passed on to future generations because those adaptations are the result of the phenotype or some different allele. So is everything adaptive? Well, anybody know who Voltaire is? You probably don't. He was a philosopher, a writer, very good at mathematics, a polymath, and he was also an atheist. This was during the French Enlightenment, and he didn't start out being an atheist, but he kind of ended up that way because of things that occurred during his lifetime in terms of the whole idea of the question of evil. Why is there evil if God is a merciful God? At the same time that he was around, there was another polymath. His name was Leibniz. Leibniz not only, he actually discovered calculus at the same time that Newton did. They used different they use different symbols, but it's the same exact thing. At the same time, though, he kind of believed that everything is for the best and we live in the best of all possible worlds. And so Voltaire wrote a farce in which he commented, and one of the main characters was Dr. Pangloss, who is based on Leibniz, where everything is the best. Now, this relates to evolution by natural selection and traits in that we think certain traits are designed or function in a certain way that are adaptive, but we don't necessarily know. We actually have to go out and test it. So, for example, things cannot be other than they are. Everything is made for the best purpose. That's Leibniz or Dr. Pangloss. Panglossian worldview. Our noses were made to actually carry spectacles, so we have spectacles. Is that really why we have a nose? Legs were clearly intended for breeches, and we wear them. So our legs were made for breeches. Are they made for other reasons? Or do they function in a way that actually helps an organism get around in the world? But you have to be sure that what may seem like an adaptation and the function of it may not necessarily be what you think it is. During this, the thing that really got Voltaire was a volcano that in Lisbon in 1755 that killed thousands and thousands of people. There were pyroclastic flows, kind of like what happened at Vesuvius. These hot gases and rock came flying down the mountainside and incinerating and burning everything in their path. Well, this for Voltaire, I mean, is this a merciful God? So here's Dr. Pangloss, though, showing how stupid such an idea is. All this is a manifestation of the rightness of things, the volcano. Since if there is a volcano at Lisbon, it could not be anywhere else. For it is impossible for things not to be where they are, because everything is for the best. Traits are the same way. But they're actually not the same way. They're not always adaptive. So Dawkins, you probably know of Dawkins. He's been writing a bunch of books lately about, the problem with religion and evolution. But he's known for the selfish gene, memes, things like that. And back in the early days, if we are to demonstrate adaptiveness, we must always identify the alternatives that natural selection had to choose from. There might not even have been alternatives that, perhaps were available at that time. Remember, evolution by natural selection works on traits that are actually there and modifies those. That's why we end up with so many things that you would never design the way they are. So natural selection can only act on the available alternatives. These alternatives depend on numerous constraints, including evolutionary history. So I would love to fly. You would probably love to fly. Flying might even increase our fitness. So why doesn't flying in humans eventually evolve? Well, it turns out there are phylogenetic constraints, or evolutionary historical, the way human beings develop, that are canalized. These pathways vary little, they're very constrained. Present conditions may not permit certain adaptations or certain traits. So there's all these things that there has to be available alternatives in terms of what selection can act on. And there can be perhaps other explanations, and you have to actually test them. Are traits that increase survival and reproduction always adaptive? Not necessarily. Now, you would think, okay, you reproduce more, you survive longer, and you're able to reproduce more. But does that actually translate into those traits or those alleles being passed on to future generations? For example, let's say you have this animal, a population of these animals, of one species. They use the resources in their environment in a certain way, but there's a mutation. And the mutant animal is able to turn those resources more efficiently into offspring. Leaves many more offspring. Unfortunately, they're so efficient and they reproduce so fast that they basically destroy the resource base. In other words, they all starve to death eventually, and they actually don't lead to any more. Their offspring doesn't actually reproduce themselves properly or sufficiently, And there is no genetic contribution to the other population. So traits, you can have natural selection without evolution. You can even have what looks like increased fitness, but really isn't. So how do we test for an adaptation? Can we assume that a trait is adaptive if it increases survivorship or increases reproductive success, number of eggs? Well, not necessarily, as I mentioned. So increase for survivorship, let's say, or reproductive success with this animal I told you about. They survive well, they turn resources into more offspring, but in fact, it's maladaptive. So, under what circumstances would a trait that increases survival or reproduction of an organism be an adaptation? And so, you actually have to demonstrate it. One way you could do it is you could see which individuals leave. You can do DNA fingerprinting over a whole bunch of generations and see which individuals are leading a greater proportion of their genetic contribution. Whether it's the trait that's actually accounting for that, well, you'd have to show that in the population. Okay. So, under what circumstances would a successful trait that enhances survival or reproduction actually be maladaptive? Well, we just gave an example of that. So, you actually have to not only demonstrate, so they leave more offspring. Do those offspring, are they successful in reproducing? Or they're the F1 generation. You see, there's the initial generation, actually the adults are. Then there's the F2 generation, they're children. But sometimes you can actually have a situation where those children, they reproduce successfully, but then the next generation, all these genetic problems start showing up, leading to actually a dead end. So if you use like reproduction as a measure of fitness, that can lead you astray.